The so-called general epistles typically include the New Testament documents Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude. The letters are distinguished by the fact that they are among the few letters of the New Testament not written by Paul and consequently reflect a non-Pauline form of Christianity. Unlike Paul's letters, which tend to be written either to a specific congregation, for example, Corinthians, or to a specific person, for example, Timothy, the general epistles are not addressed to identifiable locations or persons. The epistle to the Hebrews is so called because of the rather prominent emphasis on Old Testament theology, not because it is specifically addressed to the Hebrews or Jews. Similarly, the letters of James, Peter, Jude, and John are not so called because they are addressed to those persons, but rather because they were composed by those persons. Hence, none of these letters has a specific addressee, and therefore all are regarded as general or Catholic letters. Catholic deriving from the Greek word katholismos, which means general. Now, in this module and the following, we'll look at each of these documents with a view toward providing an overview, especially as relates to such issues as authorship, date, addressees, purpose, central message or argument, and significance and place in the New Testament canon. While it may seem a bit odd to discuss the literary genre of an epistle, we must do so with Hebrews because it defies easy description. Hebrews begins without the salutation and identification of the writer and readers, hearers, so typical of New Testament letters. That said, it does conclude with a benediction, personal comments, and final farewell expected in a New Testament letter. There are also a series of warnings and exhortations scattered about strategically in the letter, which seem to imply that the author knew the situation of the readers and hearers. Finally, Hebrews 13:22 says that the writer has written to you briefly, and the Greek word he used, epistila, is the same word from which we get the English word epistle. Now, that said, some have suggested that Hebrews reads more like a sermon than a letter. Note, for example, the writer's language often betrays spoken rather than written style. For example, Hebrews 2:5, where he says things like, of which I am speaking, rather than of which I am writing. In any case, it is probably best to continue to refer to it as a letter, albeit an unusual one. The letter is anonymous, with the author likely associated with Paul or one of the other apostles. The Eastern Church attributed the letter to Paul, but the Western Church denied Pauline authorship and excluded it from the canon. Consequently, it was one of the last documents to be added to the New Testament. The possibilities for the author of Hebrews, besides Paul, range from Barnabas to Priscilla to Apollos to Luke. It is probably best to stand with the Greek church father Origen, who said, God only knows who wrote Hebrews. As to date, two clues to dating are the fact that the writer assumes sacrifices are still ongoing in the temple. Therefore, a date before AD 70 is possible. The other is the fact that though the community addressed is experiencing persecution, no martyrdoms have as yet been documented. Hence, a date before the Neronian persecution in the early 60s may be assumed. The author presupposes a thorough understanding of the Jewish faith and its rituals. Yet he writes in some of the best Greek in the New Testament. And so Hellenistic Jews in the diaspora is the best guess when it comes to addressees. As to the message, Jesus is God's final definitive revelation, superior to all other revelations, including God's self-revelation to Israel. And as to significance, the writer warns Greek-speaking Jews in the diaspora not to return to Judaism lest they fall away. The Greek word here is apostasy, never again to be restored. To accomplish this, he composed an elaborate theological reflection around the theme, the superiority of Christ and his sacrifice, employing Jewish midrash or commentary as the primary interpretive tool. There are also demonstrable similarities, especially in terms of its method of interpreting the Old Testament with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Hebrews is important because it clearly attests to the Jewishness of early Christianity. The Jewishness of the letter, the author in chapter 2, verse 2, refers to Christian churches as synagogues. The apparent familiarity with the teaching of Jesus and the fact that the author feels no need to identify himself beyond James, servant of God, all argue for James, Jesus' half-brother, as the author. Incidentally, the author's name is actually Jacob, not James. There are no Jameses in the New Testament, James being an Anglo-Saxon name, not a Hebrew name. The translators of the King James Version of the Bible decided to translate all Jacobs in the Bible as James, except for the patriarch, both to avoid confusion, as well as to secure the approval and blessing of the patron monarch, King James of England, who was a Roman Catholic, and as such opposed the translation of the scriptures from the Latin Vulgate, the version preferred by the priests, into the vernacular where the uneducated had access to them. As to date, if James, Jesus' half-brother, was the author, then the date was sometime before AD 62, when James' martyrdom is reported. As to addressees, they were almost certainly Jewish Christians, the earliest believers in the church. With respect to message, there is no unified argument as such in James. This is because the letter is an example of Jewish paranesis, or a collection of wise teachings and aphorisms. Think the book of Proverbs, connected more formally, that is through catchwords, than logically. If one had to isolate a central purpose in the book of James, it would be to champion orthopraxy, right living, over orthodoxy, right belief. Or as James puts it, faith without works is dead. As to the significance, some regard James as a rejoinder to address a misunderstanding and misapplication of Paul's writings, which had been misunderstood to say that one can legitimately have a workless faith. The letter of James makes the point, often using Paul's own arguments and very words, that faith without works is dead. James was one of the last books to be admitted into the Christian canon because it was perceived to contain sub-Christian theology, that is, more Jewish than Christian. Martin Luther, the reformer, even went so far as to call it a, quote, right strawy epistle, end quote. However, it can be deemed sub-Christian only if one defines Christian exclusively by a few of Paul's statements in Galatians and Romans and ignores the rest of Paul's writings, not to mention Jesus' statements about right living in places such as the Sermon on the Mount. C.S. Lewis said it best when in Mere Christianity he wrote, "Christians have often disputed as to whether what leads the Christian home is good actions or faith in Christ. I have no right really to speak on such a difficult issue, but it does seem to me like asking which blade on a pair of scissors is most necessary."